In a small, quiet town in India, the hospital stands as a beacon of hope and care, but sometimes, it becomes a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead blur. It was around 3 a.m., the witching hour, when the world is at its most silent and the veil between the living and the dead is at its thinnest. I was in the basement of the hospital, a place where light rarely penetrates. The only sounds were the distant hum of machinery and the soft, eerie creaks of the old building settling. I was there to grab a new gurney. Ours had been destroyed by a violent patient earlier in the night. The basement storage unit was a maze, packed with equipment and old supplies. The air was thick and musty, with an unsettling stillness. As I navigated through the clutter, I felt a sudden tug on my shirt. My first thought was that I had snagged it on something, but as I looked around, there was nothing close enough to catch on. Dismissing it as my imagination, I continued. Then, it happened again, but this time, it was different. It was stronger, and accompanied by a sound that sent chills down my spine. A little girl's voice, crystal clear, saying,
"I'm lost."
My heart began to race, my pulse pounding in my ears. All the hairs on my body stood on end. I was frozen, unable to comprehend what I had just heard. I quickly called my partner down to help with the gurney, not wanting to be alone in that moment. As we worked together to maneuver the new gurney, I kept my eyes and ears alert, but there were no further signs of the little girl. Later, I spoke with nurses, CNAs, and even some physicians about what I had experienced. They shared their own stories, tales of strange happenings, especially in the ICU and hospice sides of the hospital. Whispers of voices, fleeting shadows, the feeling of being watched. One nurse recounted an experience in the ICU. She was doing her rounds late at night when she saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, a small child. When she approached, the figure vanished, leaving behind a cold spot that chilled her to the bone. Another CNA told me about the hospice wing, where patients often reported seeing a young girl playing in their rooms. She would smile and giggle, but when staff members entered, she would disappear, leaving only the soft sound of laughter echoing in the halls. One physician shared a particularly haunting story. He had been working late one night in his office when he heard a faint knocking on his door. When he opened it, there was no one there, but he felt a cold breeze brush past him. Moments later, he heard the sound of soft footsteps running down the hallway, but the corridor was empty. These experiences accumulated, creating an eerie tapestry of the hospital's spectral history, reminding us that in the quietest moments, we may not be as alone as we think. I worked at a very nice nursing home for a while as a med tech/CNA while I was in school. I was stationed on the memory care unit. The residents were genuinely well cared for, happy. The facilities were clean, the whole 9 yards. One of the residents, Mr. B, had been there since opening day. He was very particular and liked things his way. He had his seat in the dining room, got exactly 3 scoops of strawberry ice cream after dinner, and sat in his chair by his window until exactly 11:30. Just a grumpy little cutie pie. He was a fixture of the unit. His routines were as predictable as the sunrise. Well, inevitably, Mr. B passed away. The loss was felt by everyone, staff and residents alike. Less than a week later, a new resident moved in with her own things, but her bed and armchair were in the same place as Mr. B's. Her first night, I had done my rounds and was doing whatever mundane tasks I did at night after residents were in bed, washing compression hose or something. It was a quiet night, the kind where every creak and groan of the building seemed amplified. I was deep in thought when the new resident came down the hall, looking visibly upset. "There's a man in my room telling me to get out," she said. We had a male resident who sometimes wandered, so I assumed it was him and went with her to her room to take him back to bed. Her room was empty. Assuming it was still him, I tucked her back in and went to find him. No one was up, and the wanderer was asleep in bed. Oh well, maybe she dreamed it, I thought. I went back to the desk, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over me. About 20 minutes later, she came up again, this time more insistent. He said to get out, that I'm in his room. I walked her back to her room, feeling a growing sense of unease. Once again, there was nothing there. She pointed to her armchair and said, "He said to move my chair and put his back and to get out of his room." At that point, my brain put two and two together. It couldn't be, but the coincidence was too strong to ignore. I ended up letting her sit in the nurse's station with me until the third shift showed up. We chatted quietly, trying to keep her calm, but the unease never really left me. When the third shift CNA arrived, she started complaining about the new resident being up. I explained what happened, and she rolled her eyes, muttering about my incompetence under her breath. She stormed off down the hallway, determined to set things right. I followed her, curious to see how she would handle the situation. She marched into the new resident's room and said, "Mr. B, you are dead. This is not your room anymore. Go on and let this poor woman sleep." The room felt heavy, as if the very air had thickened, but then, a strange calm settled over everything. The new resident went to bed, and there were no more complaints of nighttime visitors after that. After that night, I couldn't help but think about Mr. B. His routines, his particular ways, how strong his presence had been in life, and apparently, even in death. It made me wonder about the ties we leave behind, the impressions that linger long after we're gone. Working in memory care, you get used to the unusual, the inexplicable. But this experience was something different. It was a stark reminder that sometimes, the past isn't as far away as we think, and the line between the living and the dead is more fragile than we can ever truly understand. Every now and then, a new resident would have a similar experience, a complaint about a man telling them to get out. Each time, I would walk into the room and firmly tell Mr. B, "You are dead. This is not your room anymore. Let this person sleep." And just like that, things would return to normal. The new resident would settle in peacefully, and there would be no more complaints of nighttime visitors. Mr. B's story became a quiet legend among the staff. A reminder that in our line of work, the extraordinary is often just a heartbeat away, and that sometimes, a firm word is all it takes to bring peace to both the living and the dead. I started my nursing career at a small, very old urban hospital that was in the process of shutting down. The labor and delivery unit was the only one still operating, while the rest of the hospital felt almost abandoned. There were a few clinics and offices, but they weren't open during the nights or weekends. It was a strange atmosphere, filled with the echoes of what once was, and the stillness of the empty halls weighed heavily on my mind. One night, we had an urgent C-section for a patient from out of town. She arrived without a support person, which added to her anxiety. I was scrubbed in, assisting the surgical team, and everything initially seemed to be going smoothly. The lights were bright, and the familiar sounds of the operating room were present. The beeping monitors, the voices of the staff, the rustling of sterile supplies. But then, things took an unexpected turn. In the middle of the procedure, the anesthetist began trying to communicate with the patient. "Are you okay?" she asked. Despite her vitals being stable, the patient suddenly stopped responding. There was a palpable tension in the room as the anesthetist called out to her multiple times, but there was no reply. It felt like time had frozen, and I could sense the anxiety creeping in. After a few long moments, the patient began to respond again, and we continued with the surgery as if nothing had happened. Once the procedure was finished, I took her to the recovery room, where it was just the two of us. The babies were in the NICU, and the quiet of the recovery room felt heavy. I monitored her vital signs and made sure she was comfortable. Eventually, I brought up the strange episode during the surgery, curious about her experience. She looked at me, her expression a mix of bewilderment and fear. "I saw my grandmother in the operating room," she said. "I was so scared and asked her to hold my hand, but she told me she couldn't touch me." Hearing that in the stillness of the hospital at 3 a.m. sent a chill down my spine. It was a profound moment, and I could feel the weight of her words linger in the air. I tried to reassure her, but my mind was racing. The hospital felt even more isolated in that moment, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every creak of the building echoed around us, and I began to question the shadows that danced at the edges of the dim light. The atmosphere was thick, and I felt a sense of being watched, as if the very walls were holding their breath. As the hours passed, I stayed close, frequently checking on her and monitoring her recovery. The patient began to relax, but the feeling of something unseen in the room never fully dissipated. Every trip to fetch supplies or check on other patients felt heavy with an unshakable tension, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. In the quiet moments, I couldn't help but reflect on the history of the hospital. It had served countless patients over the years, and I could only imagine the stories hidden within its walls. Eventually, morning light began to filter through the windows, and the first staff members of the day trickled in. The hospital began to come alive again, and with it, the strange heaviness began to lift. The patient was stable, and as the sun rose, the surreal events of the night faded into the background. In the years that followed, I heard other nurses share their own unexplained experiences in that old hospital. Stories of strange noises, fleeting shadows, and feelings of presence were not uncommon. It seemed the hospital was a repository of memories, with some lingering long after the patients had gone. Reflecting on that night, I realized how the line between the living and the dead can sometimes blur in such spaces. If something similar happened again, I'd know how to approach it. Sometimes, simply acknowledging a presence and asking for peace can create a calming effect. It's a reminder that in our line of work, we're often surrounded by the echoes of lives that have touched this place, and perhaps they still watch over us in some way. It was my second night with a patient in his late 80s. He was terminally ill and preparing to transition to home hospice care. The first night had been uneventful, but on this night, things took a curious turn. In the middle of the night, as I made my rounds to check vitals, I found him talking out loud in his sleep and fidgeting. This was unusual since he hadn't done it the night before. I gently woke him up and asked what he was dreaming about. He smiled and told me he had been dreaming about being with his friends when he was younger, reminiscing about their times at the bar and partying together. He said those were some of his favorite moments in life. I thought it sounded like a wonderful dream and left after finishing my care. A couple of hours later, I left with a coworker to pick up a patient. When we returned, we found the unit in a state of excitement and unease. My coworkers, even the senior nurses, were visibly shaken. They quickly filled me in on what had happened while I was away. My patient was monitored by a portable video camera because he could be forgetful at times. On the camera, my coworkers had witnessed multiple orbs shooting through the room, resembling shooting stars. It wasn't unusual to see orbs occasionally, but they said the number was extraordinary this time, to the point where the room seemed to glow. Some of my coworkers had even gone into the room to check, but each time they entered, the orbs would disappear, only to return when the room was empty again. By the time I got back, the orbs had just stopped. About 15 to 30 minutes later, my patient woke up and, to my surprise, decided to get out of bed. This was odd since he hadn't shown much inclination to move around the previous night. I went into the room and asked where he was going. He pointed to an area behind me and said his friends were there and wanted to play cards with him. My coworker who was with me went pale. I kept my composure and told him they could play cards a little later, then gently tucked him back into bed. The whole situation felt strangely wholesome to me. It seemed as though his friends had come to keep him company in his final days, a comforting thought that brought a smile to my face. However, my coworkers thought I was nuts. They couldn't understand how I was so calm about the whole thing. To me, it felt like his friends had just stopped by to say hi, a final farewell to their old companion. Not a nurse, but when my mom was in hospice, I stayed overnight the few nights she was there. She wasn't overly communicative or aware at this point, but she kept looking at the upper corner of her suite and would occasionally wave her arm in that direction. I remember waking in the middle of the night once while I was there. I had dreamt about the people who were in that corner of her suite. The dream felt so vivid, so real, that I couldn't shake the feeling when I woke up. I was scared, my heart pounding. I had my dad come and keep me company for the remainder of the night. The next day, my aunt came to the hospice house and made me leave for lunch. I didn't want to go, afraid to leave my mom's side, but my aunt insisted. When we returned, my mom's nurse stated that if there was anything I needed to say, now was the time, as my mom was breathing her last breaths. It was a deeply emotional moment. I sat by her side, holding her hand, whispering all the things I wished I had said before. I felt a mix of peace and sorrow, knowing she was surrounded by love in her final moments. And then my mom took her last breath, and she was gone. Later on, I was going through photos at home to prepare for my mom's funeral. I came across a photo that stopped me in my tracks. It was a photo of the people from my dream. The same people who had been in the corner of her suite. My maternal grandmother, who had passed away years ago, a great-aunt, and my great-grandmother. My aunt, who was going through the photos with me, confirmed their identities. The realization hit me hard. I had seen these family members in my dream the night before my mom passed. It was like they were there to guide her, to keep her company as she transitioned from this life to the next. It felt both comforting and unsettling. After sharing this experience with my family, they began to believe I had a gift, a connection to something beyond our understanding. I had no way to corroborate what I saw. It could have been my mind playing tricks on me in my grief. But it felt so real, so profound. This experience has stayed with me, a bittersweet memory of my mom's final days. It was a kind of special last moment where I felt connected with her, and perhaps with something greater than us all. Whether it was real or imagined, it brought me comfort and a sense of peace during a difficult time. As I reflect on it now, I realize that these moments, whether grounded in reality or something more ethereal, have the power to bring us solace and a deeper connection to those we've lost. It's a reminder of the enduring bonds of family and love, transcending even the boundaries of life and death. On one of the old floors I used to work on, we always had strange occurrences happen at night. This was a neuro step-down unit, a place where the boundaries between life and death often felt blurred. The unit had glass walls so we could chart and monitor our patients easily. One night, a particular incident left us all shaken. We had a patient who had suffered a severe stroke. He was nonverbal, with a feeding tube, restrained, and required total care. Family visits were rare, leaving him isolated in his room for most of the time. In the middle of the night, the call light for his room went off. I answered it, and to my surprise, I heard a woman's voice say, "He is really hurting. He needs his pain medicine." It was so clear, so insistent, that I didn't question it for a moment. I walked into the room to check on him. The room was dark, silent, and empty except for the patient, who was sound asleep. No one else was there. I thought it was odd but figured maybe I had imagined it. I went back to the nurse's station and sat down at the CN desk. Moments later, the call light went off again. It was his room. The same voice, now sounding more urgent, said, "Please, he is really hurting." A chill ran down my spine. This time, I was more apprehensive as I walked back to his room. Again, it was dark, empty, and the patient was still sleeping peacefully. I told his nurse what had happened, and she decided to administer pain medicine through his PG tube and reposition him in bed, just in case. After that, the call light didn't go off again that night, but the eerie feeling lingered. Strange things always seemed to happen on that floor, and this was just one more incident to add to the list. There was another time when a different patient, who was also nonverbal, had their call light go off repeatedly. Each time, when we answered, we would hear what sounded like faint whispers or soft crying. But there was never anyone there. We would find the patient sleeping or staring blankly into space. completely unaware of what was happening. One night, one of the newer nurses reported seeing shadows moving across the walls in one of the empty rooms. She was visibly shaken and refused to go back into that room alone for the rest of her shift. Another unsettling event occurred when a patient with dementia kept pointing to the corner of the room, saying that a man was standing there. We brushed it off as a hallucination, a symptom of her condition. But one night, another nurse saw a dark figure in the corner of the room while checking on the patient. She blinked, and the figure was gone. The patient, however, kept insisting that the man was still there. We also had issues with equipment malfunctioning in inexplicable ways. Monitors would go haywire. Alarms would sound for no reason. And lights would flicker. Maintenance could never find anything wrong. And the problems would just as mysteriously stop as they had started. Despite these experiences, we continued to care for our patients, trying to keep our rational minds in control. Yet, the strange occurrences were hard to ignore, and left us with more questions than answers. After the night with the call light incident, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching over our patients, perhaps trying to communicate with us in ways we couldn't understand. The voice on the call light, the shadows, and the eerie sensations all contributed to a sense of unease that hung over the unit like a thick fog. In the end, we could only speculate about what was really happening on that floor. Whether it was the lingering spirits of former patients, residual energy, or simply our minds playing tricks on us during the long night shifts. We never found out. But those experiences stayed with us, a haunting reminder of the thin veil between our world and whatever lies beyond.